Hello and welcome to the Information's fifth annual Autonomous Vehicle Summit. My name is Amir Efrati. I'm executive editor at The Information. This is our second year doing this virtually. In all likelihood, next year we will be back in person. So look forward to seeing you all again. There's a lot of information out there in the world, including on mobility topics. And our mission is to give you information that is actually valuable. So without further ado, we should kick things off. I wanted to mention that if you want to participate in social media, tweet at us, refer to what you're watching and comment on it. That way you can use the hashtag TIAVS. If you're inclined, you can also tweet at me. I'm just at Amir. And you can also send me an email anytime you want, amir@theinformation.com. A very special thank you to our partners, Torque Robotics, AI, that's AEYE, and Deepen AI. You'll be hearing from them a little bit later. Okay, on to the state of the industry presentation. There's no doubt that we are squarely in the trough of disillusionment among technologists and in the press about this field, though notably not among investors. So we're going to spend today talking about how we can get out of that trough. Let's start where we always start, which is way too many human error-caused deaths on the road. It's on my mind this week because one of my colleagues was recently injured by a semi-trailer truck driver who sideswiped her and sent her Honda across two other highway lanes and into a ditch. I don't think anyone would have believed you if you'd said that in 2020, in the year of COVID lockdowns, in which we all drove 13% fewer miles than in 2019, that we would have 7% more fatalities. That is not something that anyone expected. People are still driving drunk, or they're impaired in some other way, or they're rushing to try to deliver packages or food or something else. It's kind of clear that we cannot expect our speeding laws to change and become more stringent. So technology is really going to need to pave the way. The best news that I've seen, at least for one type of collision, which is low speed frontal collisions that kill pedestrians or cyclists, there is clear progress. Last year, 13 out of 20 major automakers installed low speed automatic emergency braking and forward collision warnings to more than 90% of new vehicles. That is fantastic. Ford has made considerable progress, rising to 91% of new vehicles with AEB, up from 65% in 2019. GM also made progress, but is still woefully inadequate. And bringing up the rear, unfortunately, is Fiat Chrysler, which is 14% getting AEB. That is dreadfully poor. The best firms in this area have been Tesla, Volvo, Audi, Toyota, and Mercedes, so kudos to them. Another important milestone to point out is Mobileye, which is enabling all these driver assistance features, just became a $1 billion a year business with a 20% operating margin. And because of its sales in 2020, it means that 25% of cars globally are getting some form of AEB, up from 20% in 2019. So clear progress. But we should definitely call out and talk about Tesla now, which is obviously the company that gets the most attention in this ADAS space. I think people consider them to be like the cowboys of autonomous driving, and we've been making fun of Elon and his ridiculous predictions for years, even when car manufacturers of other companies were taking him seriously. But it should be noted that for all the hand-wringing that we've been doing about whether humans were prepared to oversee automated steering features like Tesla Autopilot, it has not yet been a complete disaster. The number of deaths from misuse of autopilot, while unfortunate and potentially avoidable, have been actually fairly small, smaller than many of us expected, ranging between a handful to not more than a dozen or so. Regulators are watching this space very closely, including the full self-driving beta that Tesla has been rolling out. So there's going to be a lot to discuss coming up. We also don't know about the misuse of autopilot that's leading to non-fatal collisions, which there is a lot of. So that's also a question worth asking about. On to robo-taxis. It was a tough year, a painful year, a lot more cash burned without much payoff. Whether you were in the US or China, even though COVID stopped testing for a number of weeks, you still had to be paid. And Waymo is now up to more than 2,000 employees now. So that is a lot of people to take care of. The biggest thing that's happened in this industry or in this realm certainly is Waymo's arrival into San Francisco. San Francisco's always been the goal for Waymo, because that's where a taxi business can thrive. But it just goes to show how much trouble that they've had in Phoenix, because they were supposed to kind of tackle and dominate Phoenix before moving on to San Francisco. But that driverless taxi service in Phoenix is still nascent. It's very impressive in its own right, but still very nascent and has a lot of problems. The fact that they made this jump to San Francisco really says to us that they want their vehicles to start learning the hard way in a market where Waymo may actually have a real business, and where people actually don't want to drive. People in Phoenix still do want to drive. And in San Francisco, the roads are notoriously perilous. So that's really the biggest thing that has happened. The M&A and consolidation has continued, and basically there are now 6 players to talk about after Uber, Lyft, and Voyage bowed out last year. Those companies are there. Even with Apple, it's probably best to view Apple as mostly an electric vehicle effort at this point. Electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles are a bit divorced from one another. So there you go. We're actually going to be talking to leaders from 3 of those companies coming up very shortly. On to trucking. Lots of new financing activity here, as we just reported this morning. The biggest debate in this field is about whether developers need to be joined at the hip with a truck manufacturer to actually build a complete product from scratch, or whether you can kind of go it alone for now, not worry about working with the truck manufacturer closely and just focusing on the software. We're going to be talking about this very soon. Just keep in mind that all these deals that you read about with Aurora, Too Simple, Waymo, and others, they're non-exclusive deals, so they can change, and they probably will change over time as the industry shifts around. The biggest surprise for me in working on this presentation is just seeing how much more funding there is for autonomous vehicles and adjacent technologies. It's not something that I realized, but in the past 12 months, the funding has been 40% higher than it was in the prior 12 months. A lot of that is due to the public SPACs of the LiDAR makers, as well as the Too Simple IPO, and plenty of other private financing. Biggest one is Cruise by far in the past year. And there have been obviously a number of others that you see here as well. And it's really astounding, when you think about it, as we talk about the public market on to the next slide, is that, a lot of this risky R&D effort that until basically last fall was firmly in the domain of private financing has quite suddenly been shifted to public investment. And that's going to present its own challenges. Short sellers are going to be there watching. There's going to be real financial consequences when deadlines are missed. But it should be said that these companies that have gone public here on this chart, it's been great for them. They've gotten valuations that I never expected them to get. Maybe some of our speakers can explain how these valuations are being calculated. $8 billion for Luminar, $8 billion for Too Simple. That's pretty incredible. A lot more coming down the pike. We've got Plus, which is focused on trucking for China, AI, which is one of our speakers today, Aurora also speaking, Argo speaking, Locomation speaking, and Embark Trucks as well, all in the kind of queue to go public. Let's talk a little bit about the perception of the industry. A couple of years ago, that was peak hype, not at the information. If you were reading us, you knew what was actually going on with the tech, but really crazy headlines a couple of years ago. Then into kind of the 2019, 2020 period, things really settled down, a lot more realism. And by now, as we move on to the next slide, we are firmly in the trough of disillusionment. Even Elon has gotten in on the act. And it's really quite cynical and dejected, the kind of commentary that we see now in some of these articles. Despite the fact that progress is being made, a lot more money is coming into the field, and this is probably a little bit of an overreaction in some ways when people are saying, "Oh, you won't see anything until 2050." But clearly there is something happening behind the scenes. So where do we go from here? A lot of questions that we're going to get into today. Really thinking hard about what Waymo in Phoenix represents. It's kind of like the first version of the product that we want, but it ends up being more like Magic Leap. If you're familiar with the AR, VR world, and the question is, what is needed to get to the Oculus 2 level product that people actually want to buy and are very happy to buy in mass. So that's the biggest question. I think the discussing the public markets is important. Discussing whether trucks are actually easier to automate than passenger cars, or whether they're deceptively difficult. That's another important area. We've talked about moving from the suburbs to urban testing for the passenger cars, which is related to the question of how much autonomous vehicle systems can extrapolate from one environment like Phoenix and transfer over to San Francisco. That's a very important topic as well. And then really getting into practices, best practices that this industry needs to have around safety or systems engineering. What can it borrow from defense contractors? And will people in this industry finally agree on standards for measuring AV safety? Everyone does it in a slightly different way. These are very important conversations that we're going to focus on today. Next up is Brian Selesky, CEO of Argo. Please get your questions ready for him.